I was reminded that I had forgotten to turn on the recording option. All right, so good afternoon and thank you all for joining us here today. The two books that we will be discussing today reflect long-standing concerns we have encountered in classrooms, research supervision, fieldwork, and institutional spaces. Questions about how knowledge is produced, how truth is claimed, and how research can remain accountable to the people and worlds it seeks to understand. Shashi, can you change it? Okay, never mind. The books, which will come up shortly on your screen, we're still waiting for that to happen. Ethical Considerations for Research and Practice in the Human Sciences, and Reframing Developmental Psychology, Perspectives from the Global South, emerge from our own experiences and observations, and continuing dialogue with scholars as teachers and researchers in the university system. Let me begin by introducing the first book to you. Yes, Shashi, can we leave it at this? Thanks. The first book that we are talking about over here, hi Pina, Ethical Considerations for Research and Practice in the Human Sciences, which Bhavna and I worked on together. This volume brings research ethics into focus as a living, relational, and context-dependent practice. It argues that research in the human sciences is not simply technical work guided by fixed rules. It unfolds within shifting cultural, ecological, and social settings where people, relationships, and histories matter deeply. The contributors to this volume challenge the tendency to treat ethical guidelines as universal standards or institutional guarantees of responsibility. This is not to deny the universal importance of ethics in research, such as the obligation to avoid harm or emotional distress, but to question the assumption that ethics can be achieved through fixed, context-free procedures. Instead, they emphasize ethics as epistemological, tied to how we know, what we notice, and how we represent people and phenomena. A key aspect of the book is its attention to field-based dilemmas and reflexivity. Rather than presenting ethics only as protocols, the chapters show how ethical questions emerge in the very texture of research relationships through negotiation, trust, cultural sensitivity, and responsibility to participants and communities. The contributors to this volume argue that ethical practice cannot be reduced to procedure, that it must instead emerge from a deep engagement with context and the uncertainties of fieldwork itself. In doing so, it argues that ethics is inseparable from epistemic choices and from how we frame questions, interpret narratives, and represent the lives of others. It also critiques the homogenization of ethical frameworks through rigid institutional review processes, which can simplify or override cultural realities. In response, the authors call for contextually grounded ethics informed by diverse research settings and by thoughtful engagement with local knowledge. I do hope that this very brief summary of the book and the three sections that comprise the volume would have piqued your interest enough to go and search for a volume and pick up this book to read further. The second book that we would be focusing on today is Reframing Developmental Psychology, Perspectives from the Global South, for which I was very fortunate to be able to collaborate with Dr. Nandita Chaudhary. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The second volume turns to the field of developmental psychology and asks how universal its universal claim really is. It critiques the discipline's reliance on Euro-American theories, weird research samples, and developmental categories that often fail to recognize cultural variation. Rather than treating these issues as gaps, The book positions them as structural limits that shape how childhood and development are interpreted globally. It proposes a shift in perspective. Developmental psychology must take seriously the epistemologies, histories, and lived worlds of communities in the global south, not only to fill an empirical absence, but to rebuild the conceptual foundations of the field. Contributors to this volume highlight how meaning-making relationships and developmental goals differ across cultural settings, and how standardized measures often flatten these differences. The book makes the case that developmental psychology needs not only more diverse data, but a conceptual reorientation to see cultural variation as foundational rather than as deviation from Western norms. It suggests that when knowledge emerges from multiple epistemic locations, new theoretical possibilities for understanding childhood and development come into view. Importantly, the volume advocates interdisciplinary and collaborative approaches, drawing on anthropology, sociology, history, and philosophy. I turn now to a small description on how we think the two books speak to each other. Although the books engage different domains, they are held together by a shared concern: the conditions under which knowledge is produced about human beings. Both encourage a move away from rigid universalisms, whether in ethical review processes or in developmental theory, and towards scholarship that is culturally grounded and aware of lived complexity. Ethical considerations reminds us that research must begin with reflexive epistemic responsibility, knowing that our inquiries are shaped by culture, context, and relationship. Reframing developmental psychology demonstrates why such responsibility matters, because theories built on narrow foundations produce partial truths, and those truths carry real consequences for how communities and children are understood. Together, these books suggest that authentic, responsive research is inseparable from epistemic justice. Ethical practice and the reconstruction of developmental psychology are not separate projects. They sustain one another. An ethical research culture makes space for plural epistemologies, and a plural decolonial psychology demands ethical engagement with people and communities. Both books are in different ways, responses to what we have witnessed over decades. Students struggling to reconcile field realities with rigid research frameworks, communities being poorly represented or unheard, and young scholars searching for approaches that speak to their contexts and identities. We sincerely hope that these volumes can offer pathways towards ethical, situated, collaborated, and culturally expansive research practice, and towards a developmental psychology capable of representing the breadth of human development. So thank you all for listening to this introduction patiently. I now hand over the meeting to Professor Roar Klempe. I'm going to briefly introduce him to you. And while I do that, can I request Shashi to move to the first slide of his presentation? Dr. Klempe is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, NTNU, in Trondheim, Norway. In addition to his expertise in psychology, he is also a professor of musicology, media studies, a teacher, and a journalist. And he has several publications that include the books Tracing the Emergence of Psychology from 1520 to 1750, Sound and Reason, and his latest book, From Metaphysics to Culture, Music as a Factor in the Emergence of Modern Psychology, 1750 to 1900s. As a cross-disciplinary researcher, his emphasis lies on the history of psychology, culture and psychology, theory of science, communication, and music psychology. I'd like to now hand over the presentations to Professor Roar Klempe. Thank you so much for agreeing to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thule. That was an amazing introduction, I would say. But I want to talk about some impressions after having read the two books. And I ended up with ethics and logic as something that we have to focus on. But also, the main question would be, is mainstream psychology only Western-centered? If you can turn to the next slide, it will be fine. And the first, yeah. So this question is the overall question, so to speak. But I will pose some more detailed questions about that try to focus on some aspects of this. And my impression of having read these two books is that the critical aspect is maybe the most crucial perspective. So my first question would be, how can research in psychology be critical? And this is digging quite deeply into the Western civilization, so to speak. Because to be critical has two different meanings. One is to criticize, but the other is criterion. That means the question about the circumstances, the conditions for something. And if you follow this, pursue this last meaning of to be critical, we have a deep tradition in Western philosophy, but not so deep. It goes back to 1600, when Descartes launched the systematic doubt. But it was maybe established as a part of the way of thinking with Kant and his critical period with the last three critics. But this was very much revived in the 20th century, especially by the Frankfurt School and critical theory in the 1930s. And later on, also an interesting figure here, which is referred to also in some of the chapters, is, of course, Michel Foucault and the post-structuralistic perspective. And his discourse analysis is very much a critical way of approaching. And then you have Klaus Hofkamps, of course, that follows with critical psychology, and you have other figures that, and especially in Latin America, where we have liberation psychology and so forth. So, and all these actions, I would say, can be summarized into the question about how are the conditions for the thinking. And but if we should go deeper into this aspect, we have to put it in a historical context, and that is exactly what I am focusing on very much in my research, and especially how psychology became a subject. And I would say, and then I come to the second question. To what extent is psychology intertwined with positivism? This is probably a core aspect. And I must say that I have to turn the history of psychology upside down in a sense, because in all the textbooks, it is said that psychology comes from philosophy. I would say no. It, especially when it comes to the European philosophy, psychology was not a part of the metaphysics during the medieval time. So therefore, the first use of the term psychology appeared, and this is quite recent research that found that psychologia as a term was a neologism in the beginning of the 16th century. And quite recently, there have been published some texts, especially by Castellani, Renaissance scholar that we do not know exactly when was born or when he died, but the manuscript is from 1525, and then he underlines that psychologia is the middle of metaphysics and physics, which means that psychology from the very beginning in modern time was in between, but also a mixture of metaphysics and physics, but hard to place actually. And therefore, this was a big challenge in philosophy during the 16th century, and especially after the Reformation. Because when Martin Luther, threw out philosophy, and especially Aristotle, out of theology, philosophy also had to exclude the theological, the Christian theological dogmas from philosophy. So in that sense, the big turn came during the 16th century, where metaphysics was at stake, and therefore we do not have too much thesis on metaphysics from 1550 to 1600. Leibniz tried to build up metaphysics, but he didn't complete it. So it was a vacuum in that area, and psychology was the problem. So what happened with the British empiricists? They adopted immediately the psychological perspective and replaced metaphysics with psychology without mentioning psychology. Neither psychology nor metaphysics. So we have these radical changes, and of course the British empiricists ended up with a kind of positivism in the early 19th century with Auguste Comte especially. But the point is that it was when psychology intervened into philosophy that the embryon for positivism started up, specifically empiricism. So what happened in Germany then? That was Christian Wolff that came up with Psychologia Empirica as a part of metaphysics in 1732. So, and that is the first explicit combination of philosophy and psychology when he published this Psychologia Empirica in 1732. And this had a tremendous impact on the time back then, especially in Germany. And this was exactly what Kant reacted to, of course, that psychology became a part of metaphysics. So, in that sense, psychology is, on the one hand, a kind of reason for the fact that we have positivism. So in that sense, psychology is, in a way, intertwined with positivism. But not only. So, and especially if we refer to Wolff, we can say exactly what the subtext here says at PowerPoint. The European empirical stand in psychology was originally a critical investigation of sensation. And that is exactly what it is about. So the third question I would pose here is, to what extent is the human mind depending on Aristotelian logic? And this is also a core aspect when it comes to how to understand psychology, because we must look at the entrance, the appearance of psychology as a consequence of the humanistic movement. And humanism emphasized a much broader use of language than what logic can provide. So in that sense, Aristotelian logic was at stake from around the 13th century and up to especially in the 15th century, which paved the way, so to speak, for the entrance of the new term psychology. That Aristotelian logic was challenged, and of course Francis Bacon is the best example, who turns also makes the new organon, where he turns Aristotle upside down by emphasizes induction instead of deduction. So in that sense, logic, the Aristotelian formal logic, classical logic, was a problem for psychology. And the best example to illustrate this is Alexander Baumgarten, of course, because he talks about the richness in language, in the poetic language, when it is ambiguous, which stands in direct opposition to the logical way of thinking, in a sense that logic always narrowed down the meaning to a more precise understanding of the term, whereas the poetic use of language goes in the opposite direction, broadens out, make it richer by being ambiguous. So, and therefore also psychology was the most important background for Alexander Baumgarten to develop his aesthetics. So the third question would I then ask, fourth we have come to what extent can psychological research free itself completely from mythic beliefs? And this is a very ignored aspect of especially experimental psychology, because Fechner is the best example, who built very much upon the Leibnizian understanding of the universe, that everything is connected in a sense. And this is exactly here the main topic in the Zend Avesta thesis of Fechner. But the point for Fechner is to make a clear distinction between what we can measure, namely physics, and what we cannot measure, which is the subjective mind, the inner mind. So the question for Fechner, which is illustrated in the Fechner-Weber law, is to what extent can we connect those two spheres that have nothing in common, so to speak? And here we also apply the Leibnizian mathematics, the differential calculus, where the logarithm is a function of the linearity. So the mind, he says, is a function of what we can measure. So we have to guess that there is a connection in a sense, and it seems to be like that. But we can't just guess, we don't know. And here is the mystical connection between the mind and the object. We have to suggest that there is a connection, but we cannot prove it. So one of the main tenets in experimental psychology has, in fact, a mythical origin, as it says that the human mind and the physical world must reflect each other in one or the other way. And this is the Leibnizian monadology as well that lays in the background. So the fifth question then would be, are mathematical expressions sufficient to make psychology to be an exact science? And this is a crucial question when it comes to research today, because the way we use mathematics in psychology is primarily through statistics. And statistics is a functional form of mathematics. And the best example of functional mathematics is the directory. On the one hand, you have a name. On the other hand, you have a telephone number, for instance, or a plate number or whatever. But they have nothing in common, but they are still related. So therefore, of course, and all the textbooks talk about correlations as the only thing. And exactly, that is the main aspect of this. That correlation is nothing more than a guess about a connection. So, especially these mathematical expressions that we apply in psychology and in research in general, are guesses about connections or correlations. So, all in all, I would say that as a conclusion here is that we think about logic and mathematics as strict sciences, and that they can be used as devices to make psychological research strict as well. However, what we have seen is that there are open holes in this strictness in the history of Western psychology, and these holes in reasoning and rationality can only be sealed by ethics in terms of the researcher's efforts in optimizing her or his accountability. Thank for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Klempe. That was wonderful, and I'm going to actually try to discuss your presentation, although I know that I will fail quite badly if I try that. So I'm going to just make an effort to just comment on actually the last point of what you said. And for us, it's an important lesson that psychology cannot be made exact by mathematics because it deals with human action. And of course, action is always ethically guided. I want to therefore talk a little bit about ethics, that rather than being an external constraint like guidelines, measurements, approvals, compliances, ethics in such a system becomes an internal condition of psychological knowledge itself. The myth about mathematics is important to assert here. Your critique of Fechner, Weber, and statistical correlations is not anti-math. It is anti-mythologized math. The key provocation is that psychology often smuggles in mythic assumptions, like the subject-object mirroring, like the measurability of human actions. This is a subtle and important argument. Although modern psychology rejects religious myths, it replaces it with scientific myth of equivalence between physical measures and lived experience. In the closing line of my discussion, I would like to just focus again on ethics, which is an important concern for us in our work. It is not that psychology should abandon logic or mathematics, but it must finally admit that ethics is not what comes after knowledge. It is what makes knowledge possible at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker this afternoon, Professor Heidi Keller. She is Professor Emeritus Psychology, Osnabrück University, Germany, a distinguished developmental and cross-cultural psychologist. Her pioneering work on early childhood development, parenting, and cultural models of socialization are well known. Her research has significantly shaped understanding of how caregiving practices, values, and everyday interactions influence children's developmental pathways across diverse cultural contexts. Professor Keller has collaborated with extensively with scholars across the Global South, contributing to a more culturally grounded and inclusive developmental science. She shares a long-standing and special connection with India, particularly Gujarat, a region she holds close to her heart. Her repeated visits and collaborations led to deep engagement with local communities and scholars. And also, I'm going to share with you here a fondness for the Vico turmeric Ayurvedic cream, which she carried back to her several times, and is now has found the source for it, I think, in Germany, if I'm not mistaken. She says it's a multi-purpose cream that takes care of all kinds of sensitive skin. So I'm turning this mic over now to Professor Keller. Professor Heidi, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mila, for this very nice introduction and reminding me of wonderful times I've spent in India. And I also had the privilege to visit Delhi and your institute a couple of times. Thank you very much also for inviting me to this wonderful event here. It's a great pleasure and an honor to participate. Congratulations to the two new books that came out recently and that make most valuable contributions to the increasing task force of promoting a paradigm shift in mainstream psychology. Indian psychologists are traditionally at the forefront of change in psychology and in other disciplines as well. I remember vividly the late Durganand Sinha, who was a pioneer of Indian psychology and among the first who appealed the cross-cultural community to overcome the colonialistic cross-cultural touch and promote indigenous psychology instead. There were basically three people, Mexico, Diaz Guerrero, one person from Indonesia, and Durganand Sinha. He raised his powerful voice that this change was really overdue, and he made such some impact actually. One of the core messages also your books express so convincingly is that there is not such a thing as universalism. But as Tom Weisner has put it many years back, context matters. But there were always psychologists in the past, in the global north, who understood that there is not such a thing in psychology that can go without considering the context. During the 1930s, Kurt Lewin promoted field theory, where the individual is exposed to different field forces, so that finally behavior emerges. During the 1940s to the 1950s, Barker and Wright introduced the behavior setting approach, which basically indicated that there are behavior settings like a school class or a church service, etc., that trigger particular behaviors of the people who are within the setting. And during the 1960s to today, Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecosystemic approach made a very impact. Actually, Yuri Bronfenbrenner probably is among the most cited psychologists ever. Yet the impact on changing the paradigms of the leading research are, to say the least, are meager. All these authors and others certainly made an impact. They proposed conceptual solutions to how persons are situated in their environment, that the environment and the context are crucial for understanding. But it's not just that there are different variables interacting with each other. It's an interconnected system. The individual, the individual is part of the context. It's not the individual and the context are two separate things. And without understanding this interconnectedness, we cannot make meaning of what we observe or what we extract from empirical methods. As I said, all of these approaches gained some prominence, but none of them conquered psychology as a whole. From the developmental perspective, especially, there were crucially important scholars who made the connection between context and culture explicit. Culture, more or less, as the representation of particular socio-demographic, historical, physical, social dimensions that that form this whole in which the individual is embedded. John Berry was one of the early pioneers with his eco-cultural approach. Particularly important is the Whiting the psychocultural approach, psychocultural method, the famous sex culture study where the Whitings placed teams of researchers in 6 different parts of the world to understand all the contextual conditions in which children grow up and were raised. And this is also one of the early examples where anthropologists and psychologists collaborated, because these teams, these research teams, were always composed of a psychologist and an anthropologist. And of course, there are Super and Harkness with their developmental niche approach that is built on the Whiting's early work, and that bring into also the dimension of the mental representations into the context. There are these approaches that were important, but as I said, they haven't led to a paradigm shift in mainstream psychology. Why is this so? Why is there no general change? Why is obviously this strong maintenance of the dominating mainstream philosophy, ideology in research and as well as application? Application is a very important dimension also to consider when we talk about decolonization, because the application is directly interfering into the lives of people. And here come all the ethical questions into place that have been mentioned before. I mean, there are many reasons to explain this rigidity of making change, and most obvious are obviously structural reason, and the structural reasons consist of maintaining the epistemic power and control in dominating research questions and methods and the interpretation of results. And this allows to interpret results that are not in line with what has been found out in the so-called mainstream weird psychology, Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, this acronym that has become so popular. And it allows to interpret the differences as deficits, and this is the justification for the interference in terms of interventions in the applied field. There is power in maintaining the important resources like funding, like access to publication outlets, career options. And also, one thing has to be mentioned here, which the late Seth-Opong called the academic allyship, that the young scholars from the Global South want to make a career, of course, and the way they can reach it is to adapt to mainstream philosophies and ideologies, meaning that they go to universities in the Global North and they support the research that is being done there. Thanks God, there are many good examples of people who did not join this group of academic allyship, but it certainly is a factor that we also have to take responsibility in building more self-consciousness and more responsibility in promoting the views of the Global South, as you are doing with your efforts here. Interventions also are a mean to eliminate differences, to make people alike all over the globe. And this is leading to another complex set of reasons, the psychological reasons. Of course, these two sets of structural and psychological reasons are interconnected, but for the sake of bringing a little structure into my discussion, I would like to separate them here for the moment. And there, the first thing here is the physics envy that is dominating modern psychology. The physics envy is something that was meant to overcome the philosophical roots of psychology, which have been discussed in the first talk. And that means that psychologists want to become hard scientists, become recognized by hard scientists by using experiments, experimental methods, by using mathematics in order to also extract laws similar to those of physics. The role of anthropology was marginalized in psychology despite the effort of the Whitings. And there is more or less a devaluation of anthropology as soft and as not scientific, even in mainstream psychology and from mainstream psychologists. But psychologists would really do much better if they would kind of see closer connections with anthropology, which is also an increasing orientation among those who are aware of all the problems we are discussing. Martha Newson, who made some substantial contributions to this new task force, she said that weird researchers seek many copies of themselves. That means eliminating differences and making the world look alike. So that also makes it more easy to navigate through different spaces. Moyen Syed, a scholar, made a remarkable or contributed a remarkable observation in a comment to an upcoming paper by Kim Bart and collaborators in brain and behavioral science. He said psychologists do not want to go wild. WILD is an acronym for worldwide, in situ, local, diverse and exclusive. That means inclusive. And that term actually was coined also by Martha Newson and collaborators. And Go Wild means that we have to overcome the weird conceptual basis, the weird methodology, and the weird interpretations. It's not enough to just add more diverse samples, but using the usual paradigms, the usual methodologies, the usual frame of reference. It's even paying a bad service to the field if we do so, because this is increasing the literature demonstrating this deficits. So the goal must be, and it's certainly difficult, and it needs a lot of reflection on the part of the psychologists who consider themselves as mainstream and as the hard scientists, to become diverse and inclusive. Let's Go Wild is the title of Kim Barth and colleagues' paper, and that must be the motto. And events like this today and the books you have contributed certainly contribute to this endeavor and should function as a motor of change if we want to talk about humans and not only about particular groups. And that means that we have to be a lot more modest than we have used to be in the past. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello, Professor Keller.
Hello.
All right, at the outset, I want to acknowledge that we all are very delighted by falling on the same screen and same thinking notions and conceptual clarity that we carry with ourselves. And please forgive me, because this is my first official discussion on this podium, thanks to the mentors here. I bring with myself both volumes and also the labor of knowing that what it means to be an editor. At outset, I want to acknowledge what Heidi said, that there is a change that has to come in psychology. And that precisely brings us to the discussion of reframing developmental psychology for ecological validity. As I move forward with the books, the 2 volumes, as we move forward with the 2 volumes, I want to bring and discuss some array of excerpts from our co-authors who have contributed in these volumes. So, as Heidi said, that there is no thing as universal, and noting at times in developmental psychology goes without understanding the context. Most of the time, when we are talking about this, and I quote from the book, the beginning chapter in the ethical consideration books titles the first chapter as A Quest to Know, the Ethics of Social Science, which sets the stage by focusing on epistemology of research. The author here makes an argument about the core of social science being an exploration of the social, which goes beyond mere observations to engaging what it means to exist as a person, the quest. The discussion questions the hegemony of established practices and urges for responsible thinking with epistemic care as guiding principle for commitment to ethical conduct, responsible knowledge, dissemination of research scholarship. That brings us to understanding what it means reframing developmental psychology. The previous session and Professor Keller's session also raises a pertinent question about not just reframing, but also it talks about why we need this shift. And the popular word which I got to know from my mentors is Global South. So when Spivak was talking of minority and majority worlds, there was a twitch in 1980s and 90s. If we have read Schroeder and all, we understood the minority is the majority and the majority is the minority, which means that in developmental psychology, most of the time, when we are talking about theories, we are talking about experimentation, we are often talking about the major, not the major, the minor world and its findings being projected on the major world. To take this very sensitively, we are also talking of it as Global South, not to create binary further, but to understand that this second-hand psychology, no demeaning or deteriorating word, has to become first-hand for our own research scholars and the Asian and Global South context. I had an opportunity when I was recording Professor Nandita Chaudhary with Mike Bolswick and David Becker. And I would like to quote, and I want to finish my discussion with that. Give me a second. Sometimes. At some point in our lives as researchers, we have made crucial decisions that remained unspoken and undocumented in our research. In retrospect, at that juncture in our research journeys, such acts and processes may not have received much attention or notice. It is only later that these unspoken actions, unrecorded activities come into focus. Some of these may be source of important lessons and insights that could have changed the course of our research pursuits and influence research results significantly. Revisiting our research journeys, we realize that these actions often set up points of navigation and present us an opportunity for reflection and decision making. So with this, I would like to rest here saying that precisely in the contextual researches contributes to ecological validity, and welcome to Reframing Developmental Psychology.
Thank you, Bhavna. Thank you, Bhavna. Thank you for sharing what it meant to put these books out and for your own vision. Our third speaker for today, Professor Vasudevi Reddy. Her work has profoundly influenced understanding of early social, emotional, and communicative development. She is especially known for her pioneering research on infant intersubjectivity, emotions, teasing, and the early emergence of social awareness. Through her scholarship, she has challenged dominant cognition-centered models by foregrounding infants as active, relational, and emotionally engaged participants in social life. Her work has had a lasting impact on developmental psychology, early childhood studies, and interdisciplinary research on human development. Her book, How Infants Know Minds, published in 2008, argues for a second-person approach to knowing minds, a dialogical and emotion-based route to an old problem And the book won the Best Book Award by the British Psychological Society in 2011. She was director for the Center for Situated Action and Communication, now the Center for Interaction, Development and Diversity, and is Emeritus Professor for Developmental and Cultural Psychology at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. Professor Reddy extends her dialogue and curiosity from babies to throwing clay. Yes, she is a ceramicist, a keen potter, and her pieces are a sight to behold. I would hand over now to Professor Reddy. Unfortunately, I forgot to introduce the discussants for the earlier two speakers. So I'm just going to very quickly say that the discussant for Professor Reddy would be Punya Pillai, who is our colleague, our friend from Lady Irwin College, from the Department of Human Development and Childhood Studies. And she will take on the role of discussing after Professor Reddy presents. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Hello?
I'm just pinning you. Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mila, and thank you, all of you, Mila, Bhavna, Nandita, for the honor really in asking me to be here. I hope I can live up to it. Okay, when I started writing this chapter in the book, Reframing Developmental Psychology, my motivation was really to tell others who might find themselves in the position that I was in 1977. So the late 70s, when I came to Europe to do a PhD and to study psychology. So my motivation was to say, this is what it felt like, and this is what you shouldn't do. You know, the mistakes that I made, and the pain that was an inevitable part of doing a PhD in those days. It's not the case now, I think. It's very different now because it's more managed. It was a strange mixture, really, of adventure, extreme excitement, because I was breaking free of bonds, and a very strong sense of being a novice. A novice, even though I mean, when I did my master's in Hyderabad and we were very fortunate to have E.G. Parmeshwaran, who was an amazing character who brought us up with the idea that psychology that we were studying was in fact Western psychology. So that was not new to us. But we still had to study it. You know, we still had to do it as a kind of this exercise in learning what we're supposed to learn, which was nothing to do with our everyday lives, or very little to do with our everyday life. So the novice part of it was, I think, I went to the West to find out, I don't know, to learn more about psychology, to learn more about myself, but with the feeling that I didn't know anything. And that was a kind of very strongly compounded by the fact that everybody, all postgrads in the West, seemed to be wonderfully able to argue, and I simply wasn't equipped to do that. It just felt like, you know, how do they even know these things? How do they have these thoughts? How do they feel? So that was what I was kind of that was my starting point in trying to write this paper. So then what happened, and what developed after that? It was a strange time, really, the late 70s, because there was this conflict between, there was also the presence of these ideas that of this very strong belief in the objectivity of science and of psychological findings. And I don't know whether some of you might remember all this stuff about race and IQ, and it was a big thing. It was a debate. You know, do we subsume science to politics, or do we actually stand up for science for ourselves? And one of the people in Edinburgh when I was there was a guy called Chris Brand. And I'm giving you this anecdote because Mila was very keen that I bring the personal even more in terms of anecdotes into this talk. And so Chris Brand was a follower of this, I can't even remember the name of this American guy who did all the race and ethics stuff, you know. White people are the best. No, they're not the best. Yellow people are the best. White people come next. Brown people, maybe. Black people come at the bottom. It was a kind of a wonderful hierarchy of superficial studies. Anyway, that was the theory. So Chris Brand met me very early on when I was there one day I still remember this, at the door to the department. And he said, did I know that Indians have low IQ or lower IQ than white people? And what was interesting is not that he said it, because he was an awful guy. He was then expelled from the university for being misogynist and blah, blah, blah. But what was interesting about that was my reaction. My reaction to him saying that was not to say F off or anything, except that word didn't exist at that time in my vocabulary, but to accept it, to feel that I had to take it on the chin, to accept this kind of objectivity of data, even though, I mean, I kind of knew with most of my being that this is kind of a nonsensical view. From there, I started doing my research, and I was discovering more baggage from my past, which is basically that although I came from India, and a very typical kind of protected Indian family, I was very deeply individualist in my approach to what's right and wrong to do in being a parent and how to be with people. I kind of had swallowed that whole package of Western individualism. And the reason I suspect is because we were so protected that in India at that time, to fight against the social restrictions that were imposed, particularly on women, people like Ayn Rand, for example, whom now I cringe when I think I thought she was one at that time, right? They really had a huge influence on us, at the same time as left-wing communist thinking had an impact on us. But this individualism, this idea was it was attractive to young people in India at the time. So I discovered that, and I discovered the inconsistencies between that and notions of privacy, which, obviously it came into conflict when I started doing my research, which was involved families, and this was also some cross-cultural work, and I was kind of roundly told off by a parent in one of my studies when I asked whether they knocked on their child's room, 7-year-old child's room, to go in, and it was like the bizarreness of my starting point became very, very clear. And he said, "What do you want privacy for?" And it's got me into thinking not only about individualism, it got me into thinking about a deeper notion of individualism, a deeper notion of privacy, which was dualism, a kind of Cartesian dualism, and whether we actually have the ability to keep ourselves emotionally hidden from everybody else. And so to discover all of this was like a big thing in terms of shaping how I then got to study how infants understand other people, and the fact that it's very different across cultures, and it's not something that you can take for granted, the dualism that most of psychology was brought up on. Anyway, that was the background. For this talk, I was trying to find out, having looked quickly through the books, what is the central thread that holds both these books together? And what is the central thread that holds a lot of the people together who have written for both of these books? And I kind of thought one of the things was being an outsider. To some extent, being an outsider, for me, carried this sense of secondhandness, that the knowledge I had was always going to be less than the knowledge that people who made it had. But it also carries good things, so that the advantages of being an outsider, even now, are very much that there's this sense of rupture every time you come into contact with the phenomenon. It's kind of, in a sense, it allows dialogue. It's what Heidi has talked about very much, about you can't, if you aim for everybody to be exactly the same, I can't remember, Heidi, sorry if I'm misquoting you, but you can't have dialogue. You need difference to have dialogue. And that is something that being an outsider absolutely enables. It allows it. But to a large extent, this being an outsider can swamp you. One of the things I found very, very interesting is it's not just coming from a third world, fourth world, or any other world country to Western, Anglo-American, Anglo-European psychology that makes you an outsider. Everyone is an outsider in psychology. So I give you a quote here from Alan Costel, who wrote about the 19th century invention of the scientist was a new professional identity. Okay, now this caused psychology particular problems because psychologists were scientists, they wanted to be scientists, but they were also people. So it was a kind of a dual identity. And so what do you do? How do you deal with being a person, suppress the person, but also be a scientist? And their solution at that time was to, he argues, led to the development of estrangement as method. In other words, to be outside, to be the outsider as the best method. So this new psychology had to transform non-psychologists into non-experts. And one way to do this was to deny all the significance of intimacy, of engagement, of closeness, and of care as relevant to true psychological knowledge. So what we've done in psychology is grown up with, there's all the sort of soft stuff, and there's the proper stuff. The proper stuff, you have to be an outsider, you have to be detached. And this kind of showed itself very much also in studies of infancy and early social awareness, because the argument was, coming from a kind of a Cartesian dualism, not a dualism of mind and body, but a dualism of mind and behavior. In other words, you can't see mind, you can just see behavior, okay? The thing that infants have to learn, people have to learn about others, or psychologists have to learn about people, is about mind. Now that's invisible, that's inaccessible. All you can do is theorize, right? That's what psychologists were doing, because they were standing outside of people and trying to understand people. But what psychology also did was transform that into what babies and children do to understand other people. So you have what might be familiar to some of you, this notion, this theory of a theory of mind is needed in order to understand people, right? So that in order to access mind, you need this kind of detached outside perspective and a theorizing ability, which I think is bizarre. It's probably very much on its way out within the discipline, but probably not so much in practice, which is always the case. And in trying to understand the ways in which infants related in engagement to people with extreme intimacy, extreme knowingness, all this teasing stuff and feeling shy when somebody looks at you, it did not make sense that what they were seeing was patterns of behavior and an ignorance about what lay behind. It simply did not make sense. So in the course of that, I kind of started to discover what harm dualism has done to psychology. I mean, extreme harm, like seeing people as behaviors rather than beers. And what extreme harm it's done also to parts of developmental psychology. Okay, so this is being the outsider bit. But as I was thinking about this, I thought, okay, so we're all outsiders, made outsiders by psychology. And to some extent it's good and to some extent it's damaging. But it's not who you are or where you stand in relation to psychological phenomena that is important, but it is how you are. And I was thinking that the key thing, again, tying both of these books together in terms of how does culture come into being, how does culture influence psychological science, and what are the ethics of not only doing science, but of following through with it. How do you behave, right? The key thing, I think, is not who you are, but how you are. And the how you are in question is being present. It's being present to the phenomena you're dealing with. It's being present to people. It's not hiding behind homogenized ethical procedures. It's not hiding behind experimental protocols, which means you don't smile at your participants because you might be corrupting the data, all sorts of baggage that we're carrying with us. It is being present not only to people that you are engaged with, but also being present to the phenomena as scientists, right? So there's something, if you're dealing with a phenomenon, in any psychological phenomenon, what do you do with it? Do you sit apart and look at the theories and conclude about it? Or do you actually also allow yourself to relate, to engage in the second person, in direct feeling, if you like, openness to that phenomenon? It's a difficult one, this one, but I think you can't not do it. You can't keep yourself detached and not harm both the phenomenon, your understanding of the phenomenon, and also of yourself. And I come to this, it might sound like an odd thing to say, but that you have to actually engage with your phenomena in a second person way. But I come to it from Martin Buber's philosophy and his distinction between the I, thou, and the I, it. Some of you might be familiar with this. The I, thou is kind of, if you like, an open, whole engagement between one person and the person or thing that they're engaging with. So you open yourself, you feel and you recognize and you engage. It can't last long because it's exhausting and it is inevitably transient, that sort of openness of connection. You withdraw a little bit into an analytic frame, an I-it way of knowing the other person. You can say, oh, well, maybe I didn't put it quite properly. Maybe they didn't understand me. And then you come back into it. And there's an alternation in everyday life, in our engagements with people. The same, this lesson, this alternation between I, thou, and I, I think has important lessons, not only for psychological science. In other words, we need to alternate in terms of absolutely being open to our phenomena, being there, being present for our phenomena, as well as coming back. And only doing the latter, only doing the detached is damaging. It kills, if you like, it kills the sense of what phenomena are, what psychology is. But it's also got lessons, I think, very obviously for ethics. If you are wholly there, present to another person, intimacy, closeness, and care are not just features of who you are, but it is a demand upon how you treat your phenomena and how you treat people. So the I, thou carries with it a moral responsibility. And I think if people can do it in everyday life, they flit between one thing and another, Do you like my shirt? Or does my bum look big in this? Or whatever. You're constantly shifting between seeing what somebody's feeling and thinking, what are they thinking of me? Or what am I thinking of them? If people can do it, psychologists can do it too. And I think it forces upon us an ethical framework for doing psychology by being present to our phenomena. Okay, I'll stop there. Mila, help. Done.
Wonderful, Vasu. Wonderful.
Thank you so much for this. I'll invite Punya to share.
Thanks, Mila. Thank you so much, Professor Reddy. I recently read your work on Psychologies in Dialogue, a Personal Story. And in the interpretive dialogical framework, knowledge may be constructed between the self and the other paradigm, but epistemic inquiry and exploration almost always begins with the self. And if we look at it from the lens of Indian philosophy, its endpoints infinitely exist within the individual. Professor Reddy, in her absolutely gripping autobiographical narrative, exemplifies the importance of looking at two facets of the postmodern methodology, that is, the researcher as self and the self as researcher. She highlights the absolute need for dedisciplining ourselves and breaking boundaries. Her personal narrative, full of the mind, or rather theory of mind, heart, emotions, and battles with ethnocentrism, one's own and those of others, and a personal journey of growing up in India, the shaping of the researcher, and her continued commitment to shaping the discipline provides the most riveting account of the researcher as self and the self as researcher. I am taking the liberty of sharing a personal story piqued by what I read as an account.
Because your face.
I would rather not have.
Oh, so that was the plan, huh?
So I'll share a personal anecdote. After reading your work, I felt less guilty to know that when I quizzed an aunt once about respect for the child in the Indian family and got questioned in return, why should I expect respect when I was just a child? I was okay to think, feel, and question something, the weight of which I've carried at the back of my mind. To have respect for children, to listen to their stories, to make them feel safe, to express themselves, to just be themselves. Back then, we did not have terms like body shaming. So Professor Reddy's work on teasing of children and also teasing by children in Indian families made me revisit the work of Margaret Travick on the ideology of love in a Tamil family, where teasing was a definite form of affection. Different worlds and different ideologies, but how does one reconcile the two worlds? One of teasing as a sign of affection, dependence, affiliation, and the other of treating intersubjectivity as a logistic device of independence, assertion, individualism, and so on. Or do we even need to reconcile the two? The researcher is faced with this task for sure. Finally, on a lighter note, I would like to thank Professor Reddy for putting on record her liking for the word of Sigmund Freud. The core philosophy of his work has always intrigued me, but I mostly found a negative reception for the theory in research, writing, and dialogue. I also look forward to more work in terms of reading more work from you in terms of the centrality of love in psychology, an idea that really got me thinking as I was reading your chapter. Thank you so much, Professor Reddy. I felt gratified after reading your work. I don't know why. Maybe it is an I-thou relationship. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Punya.
Thank you, Punya. We're going to just shift one of the sequence of our schedule for this afternoon. And I'd like to invite Pina Marsico. She's here. Pina, can you turn? There she is. Okay. So I'm going to remove my pin and I'm going to pin Pina here. So welcome to this conversation, Pina, and thank you. I'd like to share that Pina has shifted her entire schedule this afternoon to accommodate our little event. So thank you so much. Pina Marsico is Associate Professor of Developmental and Educational Psychology at the University of Salerno and holds visiting and research roles at the Federal University of Bahia and Aalborg University. She is past president of APA Division 52 Society for a Global Psychology and currently president of the European Society of Psychology, Learning and Teaching. Dr. Marsico is the founder, editor of Human Arenas and the editor-in-chief of Journal of Social Action and Counseling Psychology. You know, I have had to really compress this into a few minutes. If you actually look at her sign-off on her of her email, it's half a page long. That's how prolific she is. So she co-founded the Global South Network and the European Hub of Cultural Psychology with Jan Walsiner and is president of the Jan Walsiner Foundation. Her scholarship advances cultural psychology of education and develops an interdisciplinary psychology of borders, perspective on human development and social life. Dr. Marsico is also especially committed to intensive physical training, which she does not miss out at any cost. So thank you so much for joining us here today. And over to you, Pina.
Thank you very much, Mina. Thanks a lot. This is the funniest way to present my sort of bios I have never heard, especially the last part. And you are totally right. I have never missed my physical training, including this morning. But thanks a lot. It's an honor for me to be here with you and together with people that I really admire. And thanks, Mila, thanks, Nandita, for inviting me. It was like I tried, and then finally, as I see, to make changes in my schedule. This morning, I was busy with teaching, but I postponed it. So here we are. And first and foremost, let me let's say congratulate you for the impressive enterprise you have taken. I mean, in 2 books, editing 2 books means quite a lot, and these 2 books are a great contribution to the current discussion we really need in cultural psychology, in psychology as such, today. So I have took some notes of some of the core issues that you have addressed, Mila and Bhavna, in the ethical consideration for research and practice book. which I love reading, and then also suggest you to read the forthcoming review of this book, which has been made by Raffaele Modugno. It will appear soon in Contemporary Education Dialogue, which I think is a very nice contribution to stress some of the points you and your co-authors, your contributors, you have addressed into the volume. The volume basically brings in one of the important issues today we need to reflect upon, which means knowing how we get to know things in social sciences. And this open a lot of different discussion and different issues that we may go in very many different directions. But this has already been underlined by some of you already this afternoon, for me this morning. The quest to know is very crucial today, and the ethical component of it. So we need, let's say, a reflexivity and epistemic care, while critically questioning the hegemony of established research practices. The second volume I have the honor to contribute to, with 2 chapters, one together with Jan Balsin and another one with Anna Luisa de Francesa, is an interesting, is a super interesting, intriguing reflection on developmental psychology as culturally grounded. So, we all have been trained within a sort of framework that was like, as you already mentioned, was very much informed with the idea of universal things, while developmental is essentially guided by goals that are rooted in social, cultural, and ecological terrain, right? So in something that is very, somehow local, but local and global goes together. So from where I am speaking now, aside of the funny presentation, I would very much underline a couple of things that have been so far recently launched, and that now are part of my agenda, and not only my agenda. One is the Jan Balsiner Foundation, University Without Borders. Jan and I, and together with some colleagues, including Nadita and many others, you there, we are part of this. We are trying to carry activities within this idea of a foundation that helps students from all over the world to really think differently, out of the box, because what we see in the universities all over the world is a sort of, let's say, limitation and bureaucratization of higher education. So what is happening today is like there is no space for freedom in thinking and in researching. So Jan Balsiner style, that people that know him may confirm what I'm saying, has been always to support the new ideas coming from younger people. And the Jan Balsiner Foundation has this spirit, especially for people from the Global South. Why? Because there are lots of, let's say, great minds and great ideas and, activities that are going on, but there are still small spaces for those ideas to become disseminated worldwide. So this from this, let's say, limits comes out the Global South Network in Cultural Psychology. We have been, we have established recently with lots of people from all over the countries located in the Southern Hemisphere. Is basically an informal network that comes out from, let's say, the necessity of making some changes in the social sciences. Social sciences, as you know, in 20th centuries, all over the world have become dominated by the avalanche of neoliberal organizational practices of knowledge creation and proliferation that emphasize scientific productivity, of the normal science, which renders the production of new innovative theoretical perspective difficult to emerge. Really difficult to emerge. So the focus on new ideas in understanding social and psychological processes has been replaced by ever-expanding production of empirical data with loose connection to existing theories and no orientation to create a new perspective that would revolutionize the social sciences. So in higher education especially, it takes the form of a transfer of existing general ideas systems as umbrella to create the empirical projects rather than invitation to students to create their own innovative solution. So this idea of the Global South network of cultural psychology is a new network of innovation from the Global South. And it aims at coordinating, supporting the creation of a new general perspective. It's quite an ambitious goal in social science. So, but there is, what are the vectors of this Global South network? Where I think you have contributed a lot with these 2 volumes. Are 2, basically we have 2 vectors. One is, let's say, the global, the vertical one, south to north direction and the communication. That means to disseminate the innovative perspective and knowledge construction, elaborating the global south to the north, to the northern part of the world. And the second one, which I think is the most important one, is the south to south connection. Because most of the time we communicate with our neighborhood in the, our friend next to us via the north. While I think this is something that we have, this pattern needs to be changed. And there are so many things that may happen, horizontally, right? So the Global South, it's a large, even though there are lots of reflection we have to do on what does it mean Global South. It's not just geographically only, but has to do with the practices, and it's a process. Global South is basically a process. I can spend some few more words if you want, but the idea is to facilitate variety and heterogeneity as well as cultural diversity in parallel, while emphasizing the common features of knowledge construction and innovation in a constructive dialogue with the global north. So there is nothing against, but there is a moment we really need to bring the voices, if I may say this way, to be heard everywhere. And there are so many innovative things that are happening in the Global South at large. So Global South means also reimagining the landscape and promoting participation in social science, in psychology especially. So the perspective of the Global South could play, this is my opinion, a transformative role by inviting scholars to broaden the scope of psychology. So first, we must tackle the problematic task of explaining our conception of the South, as I said. So the Global South is not just another funny label, right? Very in fashion recently, but the Global South should be understood as a process and the practices. There are many Souths also in the North, and there are many North in the South. So we have to, let's say, we have to rethink the idea of this Global South, but still the main core issue remains. So acknowledging the variety of solution, the heterogeneity of solution, and against the predominance of one single option or one single form of understanding human reality. So your work, these beautiful books you have edited, and I also, congratulate one more time, because editing two books in parallel is really heroic effort, are bringing new voice and new, let's say, fresh air to this dialogue, and we really need to continue this way, making our positions even stronger and helping people to think differently. And as Vasu already said right before me, everyone is an outsider in psychology. This is an important point. So let's continue to be, let's say, foreigner to our own territory. This will save us from any form of supremacy. Thanks a lot, and once more time, congratulations.
Thank you so much, Pina. What I did forget to mention earlier when I was introducing Pina was that thanks to Pina and Jan, we owe them the direction for where we had to head when we wanted to start these book projects. And you're the one who guided us towards IAP, which is unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. But yes, that was the start of our journey. So thank you so much, Pina. I'd invite Deepti now to come and moderate and take questions from the audience as well as those who are online. Come, Deepti. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We are really keen to understand how, you all resonate with the discussions so far. So questions and comments and critical reflections are welcome. Probably people who have joined us here physically can come to the podium and ask questions. Tell us about yourself and then the person you're addressing the question to. And those who have joined us online, I would request you to put in the questions and comments on the chat box.
Anybody here? No? You'll have to, they won't be able to know, that cannot be turned on.
Not working. This is working.
Is it working? Ask Pina if she can hear.
Pina, is it working? Can you hear me? Yeah, hi.
Oh, wow. That was a miracle.
So yeah, thank you very much for organizing this panel discussion. I have one question from Clempe. I hope I'm pronouncing that fine. Yeah, okay. So Clempe, I just want to go back to your third question, which I think was very interesting. To what extent is human mind still dependent on Aristotelian logic? And if we stay with this idea of logic, and I wish to bring in my undeveloped understanding of Hegel over here, and I'm curious to know how you would locate Hegel's science of logic. So yes, you are right. When we talk of Aristotelian logic, it is like we are going beyond the formal classical logic of Aristotle. But if you look at Hegel, and I just want to take 3 points, which I think which does inform whatever is happening in this room and to the discussions which are happening in psychology. So the subject-object distinction, which Hegel also questioned. Second is this distinction of content and method, that how they both go hand in hand, which as Dr. Nandita was talking about is also central to our discussions in ethics. And third idea, which I found very exciting in Hegel, is this fact that whenever we talk of a distinction is not something which is outside a concept, but it is very much inside the concept. And by being inside the concept, it allows for the movement of a concept. And that movement, I think, is also central to some of the things that all the speakers are talking about. So I'm curious to know, how would you locate Hegel's science of logic in your talk, which was a very layered talk and very exciting also. Thank you.
1 second. He's muted. Tell him to unmute himself.
Roar. Did the sound carry well enough across to you?
Well, I didn't
Just
catch
unmute
what she
yourself,
said.
please.
It was impossible to hear. I heard every second
Could
word.
You have to unmute.
Just unmute yourself, please. You're on mute. You're muted.
I'm not muted now. Don't you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah. But I didn't hear the question.
Would you like to make one more?
Something is on.
Someone's mic is at.
Nandita, there is some resonating in the voice, but also it would be helpful to see the person who speaks. So in order to better understand, I also couldn't understand anything.
I think, sorry.
I'm going to try to speak again.
Somebody.
Okay, very softly. Is it echoing still?
Now it disappeared.
Now can you hear me, Roar?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm so scared to speak because it's going to start screeching back at me. I'm going to hand over the questions to, please introduce yourself, Jyoti.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. So this is Jyoti. I teach in Institute of Home Economics, the same college where Mila is there. Okay. Is it okay? Yeah. Yeah. So my question is, my question is, I found your talk very interesting, and I want to go back to the third question that you were asking, which is to what extent is human mind dependent on Aristotelian logic? Yeah, so I just wanted to push this idea of logic further. So yes, I mean, we have gone beyond the formal classical logic, but in my undeveloped reading of Hegel's Science of Logic, I do find a lot of hope in what Hegel was talking about. And Hegel talks about in his work, and also whatever is happening in this particular room and in this panel discussion. And I take 3 key points, which I think have been discussed otherwise also. The first is he questions this subject-object distinction, which we often make, unfortunately, in social sciences also, which is made in the classical sciences. Second point is the content method. For him, we cannot make this distinction between content and method, and they both draw from each other, which what Dr. Nandita was talking about is also central to the discussion on ethics. Third thing, which is the idea of the concept, where distinction is something which is not external to the concept, but it is internal to the concept, so it allows for the movement also. So I'm just curious to know, how would you locate Hegel's logic in your discussion on logic?
Thank you. It's a very good question, actually. And Hegel's logic stands in opposition to the Aristotelian logic, and also the classic logic. And this is a very interesting aspect, in the sense that sometimes we say that it's just a question about being logic or being logical. But logic can refer to very many different types of logics. And therefore, and Hegel is one of them, of course. So it's a question about, rather it's a question about rationality. But the point is here that the Aristotelian formal logic is very strict.
Yeah.
And in that sense, we have to be very precise when it comes to what kind of logic we are talking about. And I mean, the best example is the computers. When we had the personal computers in the 80s, some said, it's so simple, it's just a question about being logical.
Mm.
But what we see now is that it is not, because every computer designer have their own logical way of thinking. So you have to interpret what kind of logic is this designer following. And that makes a lot of trouble, especially in over time, because there are so complex systems that we are dealing with. And engineers are following their logic, like the sound is, when the sound is off, they say instead, talk is on. Also, you turn everything upside down, so to speak, and that is exactly what happened in the 15th century. That logic was at stake. That you had to include different types of rationality. And this exactly is a very important premise for psychological thinking, because reasoning can be so very differently designed, so to speak. I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but you said you were an economic, as in economy, right?
No. I'm a sociologist. I teach.
Sociologist.
Yeah,
Okay,
I teach
okay.
in the same
But
college.
but if I was just thinking about that, the first professorship in economy came at the same time when psychology became part of the metaphysics. So, and economy is a very good example of a field in which they think that it is a very axiomatic way of thinking, and that is a Aristotelian way of thinking. I think economy is the only subject today that still deals with axioms. Like in sociology, you don't, in psychology, you don't, and all the other social sciences, you don't deal with axioms. But in economy, you still deal with axioms. So, and this is what it is about.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jyoti.
Thank you, Professor Kempe, for the insights. Can we now have another question? Please.
Thank you. Please introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Sorry, we're making everybody do this little parikrama, but
We don't want another echo.
Okay, a very good evening to everyone. I'm Dr. Vatsala Saxena. I teach in B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. I teach psychology there. And one of the electives that I teach is critical developmental psychology. So one question that we often have when we are talking about culture and development, we inevitably go into essentializing, I feel. When we talk about culture, it becomes, at least in the classroom discourse, it becomes as if it is West versus East, or it becomes, say, West versus India, and then you have to even specify, see, West, I mean, because West is also quite big, so we specify Euro-American versus India. So this kind of essentializing, I think, is a little problematic. Also, because when we think about India, I myself ask, which India am I talking about? Because if I talk about my own self, I'm not sure who do I identify more with. Maybe what we consider as the Western ideals or indigenous ideals. Like, I do not know where do I center myself, so am I truly an Indian the way we understand it? So I think this essentialization is a little problematic. Second that I would want to say is, I was reading Todd Sloan's reading, wherein he is talking about how in the capitalist system, again, we are critiquing the idea of development here. So how in the capitalist system, the middle class is also co-opted in the system. So the system benefits everybody, and we are also, in a way, complacent to the system. So who would challenge it? So the challenge then, Sloan says that the agent of challenge could be either the ethnic minority or people in the global south. Now, when he said that, I felt that maybe I am also somebody who is co-opted in the system. And then placing the burden on, say, those who are already marginalized also didn't seem quite right to me. So colonization, we often think it is as if a historical event that happened, but I think in our everyday lives, this colonization is still persisting, So this was another thing that I wanted to say. Third thing, if I could add, is that we talk about development, and whenever we are talking about development, inevitably, again, we go to westernization and then economic growth, the emphasis on productivity and efficiency, as we say. So sometimes I ask, am I anti-development then? When I'm critiquing development, say, the mindless chase towards productivity and efficiency. So am I critiquing development, or am I being anti-development to that, I answer that maybe I'm not looking at development as an objective, neutral, logical sequence of progression, but I'm also trying to look at the motivations behind development. However, again, in the era wherein we are emphasizing so much on employability and going out in the market, as a teacher to my students, I may emphasize on meaning making or meaning sustaining processes, which is more important than productivity. But practically then, when they go out, what is it that I'm giving to them? Or what is it that they should aspire for? Is it just an intellectual discussion in the classrooms? So I was also thinking maybe there could be an alternate paradigm to development, and this is what I am trying to think about, that why is development always the starting point of development is the West? Could we have or could we aspire for an alternate paradigm of development? And I think that's where I would want the discussion to be. Yeah, that's about it. It was more of a question, a self-talk that I had. Every time I go to the class, I ask myself, what is it that I'm going to give to my students, and what is it that they're going to take out? So it was something like that.
Thank you.
Anybody could answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your reflections. I'm not going to try to answer all of them because they were not questions. They are important phenomena to reflect on. But regarding your mention of culture as essentializing, it's important to know that the stance that we take in our work is not that culture is a thing, but that culture is a process. And drawing from Valsana's definition that culture is that process between a person and his or her environment. So rather than being Indian culture versus culture from Salerno, Pina, for example, I mean, there is always borders when you talk about cultures like that. She considers herself as a person, as a member of the global South. Why? Because Italy is considered as south of Europe. So we have to understand that when you take, especially when you take a country as large as ours, you cannot speak of Indian culture. There's no such thing. It's meaningless to talk about something so vast. So if we are looking at the process of culture, it is very simply for every individual, every family, every social group, that process of relating to their environment. So it takes away the essentializing of culture. Regarding development, I fully agree with you. Whenever I used to say that I study child development, the idea of the Human Development Index would come up. So you can see how economics as a social science has overtaken all others. And, the neoliberal model has compelled us to see what are we giving our students in terms of employability. I still am old school enough to say that I really went or still go to class just to be able to move both myself and the students in front of me. I don't hold myself responsible for their employability, but it does not mean that it's not an important factor. So it's just that that's not my job, right? Some people consider it their job, and that's fine. That's an administrative matter more for universities to think about. But every teacher has something that drives them, and employability is not necessarily mine. But regarding the relationship, Pina, would you like to address the issue of culture and supplement what I said, please?
Sure, I totally agree with you, and thanks for the question that has been raised, because I think is one of very challenging one. So if I may say something, I don't know if I'm sure you are familiar with this Monet painting where there are lots of nymphs. So you may see from when you look at this painting from a distance, you really understand the patterns of all the contours, the borders of any of the object there. But when you approach and getting closer and closer to the painting, things are blurring, things are getting very vague. And this is again the idea of culture. So really you cannot define where, you know, this sharp distinction of this and that, because in a context like India, even in the same, it's applicable to any other places, there are so many varieties. And if you go at the individual level, it's really impossible to make distinction. I am Italian, and that's pure Italian. What does it mean, Italianness? So cultural psychology provides some sort of conceptual tool to rethink this idea of culture as a process, as Nandita has already said, in terms of, you know, how do you work with, what are the components in the human formation of the cultural aspects? And this is something I think it's super important. So, you know, like this sharp distinction and essentialization, as you said, is something which is killing, you know, the possible understanding of human variety. And also, I would also say one more thing, which might be a bit provocative. This idea of decolonialization and you know, the opposition in perspective is something that has been provided a lot to our current discussion, but now is becoming a bit rigid. So aside of, you know, continuing discussing what is this and that, we should find a new third way to overcome these oppositions in between colonization and decolonization. This has been, you know, gave a lot of food for our thoughts, but at the moment it's become so rigid that we are stuck in this discussion, and we have to move behind to produce a new knowledge that combine and integrate perspective instead of making this, you know, as an opposite views as they are right now. I don't know if anybody is indigenous, as everybody is foreigner and stranger in our understanding of human reality. Thanks a lot for the question.
Thank you, Professor Masiko. We can now have one more question.
He's not saying anything.
Professor Klempe, can you hear us?
Did you want to say something?
Yes, I would like to comment on this essentialism. I think this is the core, because as far as I can see, essentialism is a consequence of our language, because language is always general. All the terms we are using are general, and this is the Hegelian perspective on language, which is very important, and Hegel was mentioned. So the challenge here, especially when it comes to developmental psychology, I think, is to go beyond the language, and especially when it comes to understanding pre-verbal children. So I have been very interested in synesthesia, which is something that goes completely beyond language, and because it is a way of categorizing the impression without language, and it's completely individual thing, private thing. So, and there are a lot of things that are goes beyond language, and especially when it comes to music. The fact that we can hear the different of the sound between the different instruments is a result of our immediate hearing, and we cannot put it into words. And the same when it comes to direction. When we hear exactly in which direction the sound is coming from, we are not able to identify, but we immediately we understand where the direction comes from. And this is beyond language completely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We will now have one last comment or a question.
He's calling for you.
I
One
thought
more.
there was a student who wanted to
She didn't want to. She doesn't want.
There are two of us.
Come, please come.
It's okay. We may have
Come here.
we may have problems with tea, but it doesn't matter. Questions are more important.
Is it all okay?
It's all working.
It's all working. I'm proud that I'm amongst the elitist population of my great country. Let's not forget, Indian subcontinent has the oldest living civilization in this world. Don't forget it. Take pride in it, but take the care that we have that culture to be transferred to the next generation. Every generation has the duty to transfer this information to the younger generation. You can transfer the information to the younger generation only if you are yourself a role model. So let's make an attempt to be role models so that we can teach the younger generation. This country has existed roughly for 50,000 years. The first script from words to script was made roughly 50,000 years ago, and they were expressed in the form of Vedas. Let's not forget that the richest culture is found in this country in multiple layers. And the biggest role of creating a good culture is, number one, Mother India. You have the responsibility. Number two, the father. Number three, the teacher. Number four, your partners and friends. Criminals are not born. You might have heard it if you have been reading a newspaper. Many judges informed criminals are not born, they are made. By whom? By the senior people around. So let us all become senior citizens or senior people, act as role models for the younger generation. I'm sure our culture will progress. This culture will influence the whole world. In reality, even today's environments, this culture does affect, your culture does affect other countries. Okay, learning never ends. Let us make it, sir. Thank you very much. I wish you all the best.
Just to put everything in context, that was Professor S.M. Tuli, a world-renowned orthopedic surgeon who continues to be a role model, not just for all of us, for his students and doctors around the world. He still conducts an OPD 4 times in a week in the hospital, from starting at 8 in the morning till late in the evening at the age of 94 years. So yes, he is in a very, very strong position to be able to tell us to be role models. Thank you so much, Professor Tuli. Come.
Sorry to take you high over time. I know it's time and everybody perhaps wants to leave. Just a quick couple of comments and a seeking from the editors and the contributors to the 2 books. I was just thinking, I'm Poonam Batra, and I come from the Department of Education, University of Delhi, now retired, but trained as a psychologist. I've been often blamed for being disloyal to my own disciplines, but I'm okay with it. In fact, I was wondering why the psychology department did not take the initiative to talk of paradigm change. So it's interesting that one of the core principles of psychology, if I may say, a principle that is long forgotten, but it remains core, which is the need to detach oneself to be able to look at something clearly. And I think maybe the psychology department is too deeply embedded in itself. And maybe it's because people from outside the department who engage with young people, actually. And I think, engaging with young people brings us sort of closer to understanding human nature, although critical psychologists would say there is no such thing as human nature anymore, because there's only a critical past. And I think I would just like to mention a couple of things. One, that it's been 20 years, 2 decades, since the seminal work of Erika Berman. And I remember introducing it in the BA-led readings in 1994 when we started the program. It's after 20 years that India is now beginning to talk about reframing developmental psychology. But it's a great initiative, and I congratulate the editors, the contributors to the 2 books. I have to read them still, but I must say that what is important is that perhaps the idea of critical frames of looking at psychology and the subjects of psychology. Unfortunately, there is also a politics of knowledge there.
Yes.
So I don't know whether the books cover that point. That's great, because Durganand Sinha's work was mentioned by Heidi.
Yeah.
And that's old work. Why don't we ever bring it to departments of education? Why don't we ever engage with that kind of work, which really comes from cross-cultural understanding? I mean, Piaget's 6 cross-cultural psychological studies never find their way into the departments of education, but even our own work. Now, there is a lot of critical work, I think, in psychology, which has happened outside the departments of psychology, even in this country. And I think it's important for us to open the doors, to be able to bring in such knowledges into the practices, not just theorization, but practices of when we engage with young children, whether it's education, whether it's child development, early childhood care, etc. So I just wanted to say that there is this frame of critical psychology that needs to be brought into mainstream. But we are struggling. This is a great initiative. And once again, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think there are some online questions.
Thank you so much, Poonam. There are some online questions as well. I don't know if we'll be able to handle them, but before I hand over to Deepti, I cannot restrain myself from acknowledging our mentor, Dr. S. Anand Lakshmi, who was responsible as an economist. She became a developmental psychologist and was always on the outside of psychology, but always with care. So she kind of walked the talk of the kind of approach, coming closer, being kind, being generous, stepping back. That dynamics that Vasu was talking about was something that we grew up with as students. So I would like to just thank her wherever she is. I hope she's smiling and I hope she's happy, which I'm sure she would be. So thank you all so much. Over to Deepti.
Shashi, no more questions. Sorry.
Thank you, everyone, for such insightful discussions, and thank you for bringing light into the deep winters of developmental psychology. I would now request Dr. Shashi Shukla for officially giving the vote of thanks.
Good evening, all. As we come to the close of this enriching discussion, it is my privilege to extend a heartfelt thanks to everyone who contributed in making today's event intellectually stimulating and deeply meaningful. Our deepest gratitude goes to the distinguished speakers, Professor Roar Klempe, Professor Heidi Keller, and Professor Vasudevi Reddy, for their insightful talk Their work and reflections challenged us to rethink ethics, ecological validity, and approaches in research, especially from the perspective that foreground context, culture, and relationships. A special word of appreciation to Dr. Pina Marsico for her thought-provoking concluding remarks on how to know things in social sciencing and establishing the relevance of publishing from Global South, which provided a fitting closure by situating our discussion within broader academic and ethical responsibility. We are equally thankful to our eminent discussants, Dr. Nandita Chaudhary, Dr. Punya Pillai, and Dr. Bhavna Negi, whose critical and nuanced engagements enriched the conversations and opened up new directions for thought and inquiry. As part of the organizing team, I would like to sincerely thank Professor Mila Tuli for giving all of us an opportunity to engage in such enriching experience. Professor Tuli set the tone of the program with her thoughtful introductions and for anchoring the spirit of dialogue and guided our discussion. I would also like to acknowledge Dr. Deepti Gupta, our moderator, for skillfully facilitating audience interaction and ensuring a lively and inclusive exchange of ideas. Last but not the least, our student volunteers from Institute of Home Economics, Hawkip, who's a PhD scholar in Department of Human Development and Childhood Studies, Vaishnavi, Riddhi, Shagun, and Lakshita from Department of Journalism, who really extended technical support in making the program successful. I would now like to extend my sincere thanks to all the participants who joined the discussion both in person and online. Your questions, reflections, and presence truly animated the discussion. Thank you. Before we move ahead for the tea, which is organized on the ground floor, with your notepads, we have attached small cards which mention ecologies of childhood. On the reverse of the card, there is a QR code which gives you easy access to the website, which is brainchild of Professor Mila Tuli and Dr. Nandita Chaudhary. I would request all of you, if you are eager to know, please immerse yourself in ecologies of childhood by visiting the website. Thank you so much, everyone.
Politics. I'm going to make my.
Thank you so much, everybody who joined us online. Thank you, everybody who's here. And a big round of applause to Shashi, who has spearheaded this entire event, organized every little detail, right from the water on your table to the tea, which we will hopefully be able to catch before IIC shuts it down downstairs.
I wish we could invite people on.
Yes. For those who are online, we're sorry that you cannot join us for tea, but I do live in hope that we will one day meet in person and see you all. So thank you very much. It's namaste to you from us over here. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining, for sharing your time, and for giving us the insights that you did. And I am truly grateful to all of you. Thank you so much. Heidi, Professor Klempe, Vasu, and Pina, thank you so much. And all the participants online. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.